What are some of the areas where the Catholic Church is most challenged by the TRC process?
Well, I think, like all Canadians, the biggest challenge is how to be changed by this process. There's a transformation invited of us. So how do we learn to walk the talk? The calls to action in some instances are very specific. And how do we find a new way of walking with Indigenous people? How do we take this, which we have learned, because the residential school, the TRC process has really taken us to school, right? So how do we learn to reach out to Indigenous people more and build stronger relationships? We're at the beginning of a big learning curve. Secondly, I think we need to learn to tell our history in a different way and in a much more truthful way. But that history needs to include and treat well the suffering of Indigenous people, the story of the Indian Act, the story of residential schools, the way in which the coming of European settlers, of immigrants, created profound challenges for Indigenous people and their way of life. Another challenge that the Catholic Church faces is how to hold together a deep understanding that the residential school system was flawed, that there were tragic things that happened there, and that the larger legacy of the schools is really a difficult legacy, with the reality that there were lay people, women and men, religious and priests who did serve there generously and offer themselves, and their sacrifices were genuine, and their care for the students was genuine. How do we hold those two together? The TRC final report also speaks of that and grapples with it and talks about how difficult reconciliation is when we listen faithfully to both those strands. We don't want to throw under the bus all of the people who served in those schools, but at the same time, we don't want to adopt a defensive posture, and we want to hear deeply the pain and suffering of Indigenous people in order to respond. So that's a big challenge. The other area I would say that we face here in Saskatoon, and I'm sure in many other places as a challenge, is how to walk with our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are Catholic and who want to hold on to something of their spiritual traditions, at the same time live their lives as Catholics deeply. So how do we listen and learn to them, to engage in a dialogue, and to think through where it's appropriate in our worship to include, for instance, a smudge, or praying in the four directions, where to include elements of Indigenous spirituality that are completely consistent with our Catholic faith and Catholic worship. There's a lot of discussion to be had there.
Has it been a learning experience for you?
Well, indeed it has. I mean, I think the whole truth and reconciliation process has been a learning experience for most Canadians, any Canadians who've entered deeply into the process. The accounts of how Indigenous children were taken from their homes, often taken far from their homes, sometimes forcibly. The terrible accounts of sexual abuse, but the more frequent accounts of physical abuse and of a kind of a spiritual or cultural abuse, being cut off from their culture, and the way in which the whole residential school system was geared towards assimilation. I hadn't understood that well beforehand. It's also been a deep learning experience to read the TRC's final report. And I really encourage people to engage profoundly with that text. What a powerful text the TRC final report is. I think one of the other things that I've learned, and many others have learned, or were learning rather, is the relationship between the truth and reconciliation, it's the relationship between the Indian residential schools and the challenges that Indigenous people face today. We read about the statistics of incarceration rates among Indigenous youth, Indigenous men and women. Many of the challenges in terms of poverty, in terms of lack of access to good education, a lesser quality education available to Indigenous people. There are a whole string of social problems and challenges faced by Indigenous people that are deeply connected to the Indian Act and to the Indian residential school system. And we're seeing those connections much more clearly than we did before.
Would you say that the church has taken the TRC request seriously?
Yes, I would. I think that the whole truth and reconciliation process has invited a deep awakening among the Catholic community, as it has for the whole people of Canada. And I think Catholics have learned our culpability in a very flawed Indian residential school system, much more than we had before. We've also been moved by the way in which the TRC Commission and its final report don't write the churches off. Instead, they call us to integrity. They call us to own the sins and mistakes of our past and to conversion. I mean, they call us to action, to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, to address wrongs. During the TRC process and at all of the major national events, bishops were present and offered apologies. And those apologies were received, but we also know that apologies aren't enough. So I think there is a real readiness to engage not only with the calls to action, but with a new way of walking in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. How we do that is something that we're learning together, right? These are first steps of a long process.